Hello and welcome back to Business Matters at the Hindu with me, K. Bharat Kumar. The last few days have seen a flurry of macroeconomic data having been released into the public domain. Most were monthly releases, but the big daddy was quarterly GDP data for the quarter ended March 2023. Now, did we spot any patterns emerge across data points? The answer to that is a mixed yes and no. Let's see why. Let's look at the positives first. The Indian economy, measured by the gross domestic product or the GDP, grew 6.1% in Q4, taking full year growth to 7.2%. This data did beat expectations because the RBI's own estimate for Q4 was below 6%. Manufacturing grew 4.5% in Q4 after having contracted the previous two quarters. Construction showed the highest gross value added or GVA growth among all subsectors at 10.4% growth. Agriculture too grew 5.5% on the back of record Rabi output despite a heatwave impact. Growth in gross fixed capital formation improved to 8.9% in Q4 from 8% in the immediately previous quarter, which means investments in both the public and private sectors had picked up. The Hindu reported last month that the announcements indicating intent to invest had risen sharply in the January-March quarter, recording the highest ever total fresh investments of 14.6 lakh crore, led by private sector outlays that also hit an all-time high of 10.5 lakh crore of rupees. The government's revenue collections have been healthy on the goods and services tax front or the GST front.
Monthly GST revenues have crossed the rupees 1.4 lakh crore for 14 months in a row now. Interestingly, the 1.5 lakh crore of rupees mark was crossed for the fifth time since the inception of GST.
The other good news that we've received is on inflation. Mid-May, the government released data on price rise for April. Inflation had slowed on the back of a year-on-year softening in food prices. The Consumer Food Price Index declined to 3.84% from the previous month's 4.79%. Price rise in cereals, which have the highest weightage of almost 10% in the CPI, decelerated to 13.7% from 15.3% in March. Now, let's look at some data that gives us a bumpy feel for the road ahead. First off, core sector growth or expansion in the 8 key industries of the economy showed weakness in April. The numbers marked the slowest expansion in 6 months. Half of these core sectors, including electricity and natural gas, reported a contraction. One explanation, of course, is that there was a high base effect. So April 2022 saw core sector expansion at 9.5%. But this alone need not explain the slowdown. In April 2023, the figures actually contracted 8.55% compared with March 2023. The other concern is that recovery post-COVID is still an ongoing process. In an editorial, Business Line pointed out that the Reserve Bank had said in its annual report for FY23 that real rural wage growth stagnated in FY23 despite an uptick in economic activity, and that this indicated that recovery from COVID impact was still incomplete. So, even though agriculture has shown healthy growth, weak rural demand seems a reality. Private consumption has also slowed. Rating agency ICRA's chief economist points out that while growth in private final consumption expenditure, or PFCE, witnessed a slight quickening to 2.8% in Q4 from 2.2% in Q3, it still remained muted, belying the uptick in consumer sentiment as per the RBI's Consumer Confidence Survey. In an article, she expressed surprise at growth in PFCE relative to pre-COVID levels of 2019 had slowed to 16.8% in Q4 compared with 21.9% in Q3. Compared with the preceding quarter, PFCE actually contracted 3.2%, with its share of GDP shrinking to at least an 8-quarter low of 55%. Even as we try and reconcile these contrasting signals, global brokerage Morgan Stanley seems to have been impressed with India's growth over the past decade. In a note, it said that manufacturing and capital expenditure increasing as a percentage of GDP is likely to result in a fresh virtuous cycle. It also added that India's export market share is set to rise to 4.5% by 2031, almost twofold rise from its 2021 levels, with both services and goods exports gaining share. The brokerage also pointed out that India's per capita income is set to rise from $2,200 currently to about $5,200 by 2032, which would spur discretionary consumption, which is always a good lead indicator for economic growth. Before we wind down this episode, let's look at a couple of factors that are key to economic growth, but also have been weak links in our nation's progress: education and jobs growth. A steady pace of investments will be assured for us if we as a country can assure investors of ease of doing business and skilled labor. In an article in The Hindu last week, economist Pullapre Balakrishnan said that in education, India had fallen behind countries that are manufacturing successes of the world. In the Program for International Student Assessment of about 75 countries, the countries of East Asia are at the very top, while India barely manages not to be the last, he pointed out. In his view, the lamentable part is that economic policy making had ignored workers who aspired to be skilled and aspired for livelihoods from the likes of carpentry, plumbing, or automobile servicing. In the time that it existed, he pointed out that the Planning Commission had put out a note stating that only 5% of India's population had had any form of technical training. This compared with 86% for South Korea. And on that sobering note, I bid you goodbye this week. Have a lovely time ahead till we meet again. But before you tune out, do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video on YouTube.